transgender is a different kind of threat, is a different authenticity for a person who is transgender means something different often. It's not being said as a criticism or a challenge, but what within halakha, what solutions or ideas to address the issues that transgender individuals pose towards the Orthodox community have been found. For example, the very little I have found so far has all been negative and unfortunately without very much research put into it. But for example, questions of if I, in a public place, meet someone who knew me before I transitioned and they say, a religious man, and he says in front of everyone that he cannot shake my hand, and then everyone hears that and asks me why. Is it an obligation of his to say why? If I arrive in a minyan and I am counted as one of the 10 and someone knows me from before, do they need to say it? Am I obligated to tell people when I arrive in a beit knesset that they can't count me for the minyan and why? Am I supposed to bring up in front of a group of people that I've never met details of my physical anatomy? All these issues I feel like have understandably not been addressed, but I feel like they're also different and perhaps need to be addressed in a different way.
So life is a continuing education, and certainly today is part of that education for me. And I'll tell you, the genesis of this discussion was that I began to become aware of letters. And there's such a common parlance now in culture to talk about LGBT, and I've done a whole bunch of interviews and panel discussions with people, and I realized at the end of those discussions there's no T here. We're just doing LG, maybe a bit of B, and forget about the rest of the letters of the lexicon. And it really began to strike me how much this is a really discrete kind of piece of life that deserves its own discrete discussion. And on that basis, I'm really happy to be here together with both of you. So I guess the obvious place to start is to talk a little bit about transitioning, and I'm not don't really want to delve into the past so much, but I am interested in motivations because I think motivations speak to the core existential issues of people. I want each of you in turn, beginning with you, Micha, to talk about why you wanted to transition from being a woman to a man, and maybe a little bit of the genesis of that. In other words, when did you first become aware of even an inkling that you wanted to do this, and what the time frame was from that to some sort of fruition?
Okay, so if it's all right, I would like to begin with a small correction. I did not transition from a woman to a man. Society perceived me as a woman.
Okay.
I was born female, but I've always been a man in my eyes.
You're making a sort of a distinction between sex and gender?
Absolutely. To be absolutely honest, it hurts me when someone says I was a woman, because I was not.
You're speaking here in terms of your own internal identification of who you are at the core level. You always felt, I am a man.
Not always.
But
I never felt that I was a woman, ever.
Okay.
That word even, for a long time, was tough for me to say. Huh. Yes, following up with your question, at around the beginning of puberty was when I began to feel like something was wrong. So that was about 12 or 13. Up until then, I'd always been a very happy child.
Where were you living? Where did you grow up?
Sorry, I grew up in a town in Samaria, Eli.
Eli.
Yes. Okay. So there it was a mostly religious town. I always went to schools and youth movements that were girls separately and boys separately. And there was no problem with that for me. But as I said, around 12 or 13, something began to feel wrong. I didn't know what it was for quite some time. But I knew that when the girls in my class were speaking about periods and buying bras, I began to wear layers to cover up the shape of my body that was changing. So that's when I started to know that something was different. I would write a diary. It's like a presume a way of therapy, looking back at it. And I remember writing to myself that I wish I was a gay man. And then I would read it later and be incredibly furious with myself because I would remember that I was a 14-year-old religious girl. So I presumed until about the age of 16 that I had some kind of mental illness. I presumed that I was crazy. All the more so because in my family I knew about the LGBT community, and I am including the T because I knew there were transgender women. I knew about gay people and lesbian women and even about bisexual people.
Can I just ask, how did you know that? In other words, was it from media? Was it from peers?
It was from media, and definitely not from peers, but from my family. It was never something to be hidden. It was just, it's another thing in the world, and it's fine. Yeah. So amongst that knowledge, I knew that there was no such thing as a man who was born a female. The only reason I knew that is because transgender men aren't perhaps as obvious, at least in outward appearance, as transgender women sometimes can be.
Let me just clarify for my own edification, meaning somebody comes across you and they would never, quote unquote, guess
of
that.
Course not.
Right.
And within religious society, I see it even more that even if I say to someone I was born female, they don't believe me because it's not even something that you perceive as a possibility. Because you have a beard though.
Right.
So at about 16, I read an article about a transgender man, and then I knew that I wasn't crazy.
Meaning you identified right away with what you were reading?
Yes, I read the article, the feelings this person described. I was blown away, and in one way I was suddenly so hopeful I was not insane. But on the other hand, it did make me realize that it was real and it wouldn't be able to change.
Was that ambivalent for you? In other words, is it both exhilarating and depressing at the same time?
Yes, it definitely was. I knew I wasn't crazy, but I also knew that at the age of 16, this was my thought, I would never be happy. Without even thinking of asking any sort of religious authority or looking up any information, I was certain within myself that God would not be all right with me doing anything about it, not that I even knew what there was to do.
You based that on your traditional upbringing,
yes.
Your schooling, and so on.
Yeah, without anything ever have addressing it directly, but the things I could think of that perhaps were men and women not wearing each other's garments, that was the only thing I could think of that was vaguely related, but I had this inner feeling that that's how it was. Okay. So as the years went on, many of my decisions in life were based upon that, what I presumed to be a fact, that I would never be fully happy, so I had to find other ways than what would usually be expected from a young religious woman, as people perceived me to be. Yeah. So, for example, after high school, I went to the army, which in some places is more common, but in the high school I went to, which was leaning towards ultra-Orthodox, I had to hide the fact that I was going to the army, and the one girl in my year who did tell them she was going to the army was asked to leave the school. So things have changed since then.
And most girls there, they did Shirat Leumi, or they did nothing at all?
Yes, they did Shirat Leumi, but many of them did 1 year. The school itself said, we recommend you only do 1 year so that you can start university as soon as possible, to get married as soon as possible. That was their official statement. So in the army, another thing that I decided was, once I was inside, it was something that I was good at. I was in the intelligence in the Israeli army. It was something I was good at, and that was very important. So I decided that I wanted to have a military career. I thought that was, besides the fact that it was a very good way to give back to the country. It was a perfect way to hide from life.
Now, go back a step. Have you told anybody about how you feel, what you think you are in reality at this point?
I spoke to my mother very briefly at the age of 15 when I still thought that I was crazy.
What did she think?
She doesn't remember the conversation.
What do you remember of what she thought?
I remember I was crying. I said, Ima, I think I should have been born a boy. She hugged me. I don't know if she even said anything, but she doesn't even remember it happening.
And your father, you did not tell this
No.
at the time. You have siblings?
I do. I did not tell any of my siblings.
You didn't tell, so it was pretty much you were left alone with this thought. Okay. And it remained that way throughout high school?
Yes.
Until you graduated. And when you go into the army, none of this seeped into the Tzavrishon, the interviews?
Nothing at all.
Okay.
Nothing at all. One interesting thing you asked about the Tzavrishon interview. Girls don't have a Tzavrishon interview.
Okay.
So today, if I were to go to the army as I am now, I would come on the first day and say to anyone, hello, I'm transgender, and immediately I would have an interview, whether I was born male or female, because today the army deals with it incredibly well. But at the time, besides the fact that it wasn't like that, I was in no way ready to say it to anyone. Nor did I expect to get any kind of treatment.
So you're entering the army as a female in the eyes of everybody, etc. Yes. Okay. So you go through intelligence.
I do. After a year, I go to an officer's course as part of my goal to stay in the army. I, in my eyes, need to be an officer. It's more difficult to move on as an NCO. I move through all sorts of different bases. 5 years into my service, I was 25 at the time. I was serving on a base on the border with Lebanon and sleeping ridiculous hours, working ridiculous hours. And in the time where I should have been sleeping, instead I was watching videos, short videos of transgender men who document their transition, their physical transition. After a few weeks of this, I was not sleeping enough and kept watching people doing what I wished I could do. When one night, in the middle of the night, I was suddenly struck with the question of why on earth I wasn't doing something on my own. I felt that emotionally I had to do something or cease to be. And throughout that thought process, I came to one realization that I think had been building, but I hadn't quite given words to it before. That if I was waking up every day, even though I felt like I did, which was not good to say the least, that means there must have been a purpose for me being in the world every day. And I was sure I could not realize it in the emotional state that I was in. In my eyes, it meant that the fact that I was waking up every day meant that God must love me and want me to be here for some reason. I came to the conclusion that if God did indeed love me, which seemed to be, I had proof of it because I was alive, I didn't think it was possible that God would want me to be a person who spent most of their time thinking about not being alive. So 3 hours later, the next morning, I told my commanders that I had a medical reason. I needed to finish the army as soon as possible, if I could tomorrow. Very quickly, I got an interview with a high-ranking officer who knew me from another base. And he sat me down and said, okay, everyone knows you're planning on staying in the army forever. What's going on? I had to assure everyone that it was not terminal illness or, God forbid, some kind of sexual assault that was pushing me out of the army, because that was the immediate assumptions. And then I decided for the first time to tell someone.
Wow.
So I told this person.
Did you have to prepare? Like, did you spend the night before thinking about what I'm going to say, or was it
No,
spontaneous?
it was absolutely spontaneous. He said to me, you know, you're given so much to the army. Tell me what it is. Maybe the army can give, this medical thing. Maybe the army can help you.
Yeah.
So I told him, I didn't even know how to say it. I said to him, I want to finish the army because I want to cut my hair short for the first time. I always had long hair. And change my name and start wearing a kippah. And for everyone to speak to me in male pronouns.
That's the way you put it.
That was the order. I was like building up to it. I didn't even know. I didn't say because I am transgender. I didn't even know. I knew the word, but I was embarrassed to use it.
Yeah.
His response was one of the life-changing things for me. It was a moment of shock, obviously, but then it was just, all right, let's see what the army can do for you. He said, don't leave. Give me 2 weeks. I'll look into it. You think about it. Let the army give back to you what you've been giving it for the last 5 years.
Wow. Are you allowed to tell us who this is? Or just,
I think so. His name is Yuval Shimoni. He is one of the commanders of the intelligence corps in the IDF. So a couple of weeks passed. I said yes. He looked into it. We both had no idea what we were getting into, but by that time, procedures in the army were very developed in terms of treatment of transgender soldiers. He arranged it that I was moved to his base, where I could rent an apartment near there. I requested to not have any soldiers under my command because I didn't want to impose my transition on anyone else. At least not in that way.
Yeah.
And any doctor's appointment I needed, I went out to, no matter how far it was. This base was in Tzfat, so that was not a small matter.
Yeah, it was far.
It was missing days left and right. After another year and a half, throughout that time, I went through the beginning of my physical transition. And the main thing for me that changed was that I remember one morning waking up and thinking to myself, is this how most people feel? Just happy for no reason?
Wow, that's wonderful.
It was.
I'm going to pause your narrative right there. We're going to come back to you. I want to pick up on something that Micha said and pose it to you so that you can tell your own story, Yiscah, which is that he's on the sort of seam of puberty and he feels like something is wrong, right? Which is really interesting to me because I've heard a number of people, even when you're talking about people who are lesbian or gay, using this wrong word. And it's really hard for somebody on the outside to quite triangulate, like, what's that feeling of wrong? Like, what does it feel like? What does the day feel like? Maybe you can put that into expression for yourself anyway.
Okay, I can only talk about myself.
Yes, absolutely.
So I also want to preface where Micha and I have a common point in the beginning is when people have asked me over the years, why did you want to become a woman? My answer back is, depending if the person was a man or a woman, let's say you, well, why did you want to be a man? And the usual response is, well, I was born a man. I said, well, I was born a woman, but my body was not that of a woman. I knew that as far back as when I was about 5 years old. There was a specific incident. I'm not going to go into it now. And it alerted me to two things. That I have to keep this a secret. Now, mind you, this was not yesterday. This was in the 50s, in the 1950s on Long Island, New York. I had no language other than my feelings. And my feelings were, I'm a girl. And somehow, though, when I look in the mirror, I see the body of a boy. And intuitively, I knew I had to keep this a secret. I had to.
How do you process that as a 5-year-old?
It was terrible.
Yeah.
It was. I felt I was imprisoned. I really felt I was in prison. And I had to just guard the secret with such care. I couldn't even tell my mother, may she rest in peace, who I was always very close with. I was worried that people would think I was crazy. I really thought I was the only person, literally, without exaggerating, that was my truth. I thought I was the only person suffering from this. And I suffered a lot. I felt disconnected from my own truth. I felt disconnected from the world around me. I tried to overcompensate it by being very public and engaged with the world, thinking I would forget myself. And at times it helped me forget myself.
Were you able to be as explicit with yourself at 5 or at 10 as to say the words, I really should be a girl? I am a girl? I mean,
if somehow I could have trusted someone for me to be able to say that to, that's what I would have said.
And were you able to say it yourself, or you didn't know the words?
I said it to myself.
You said it yourself.
I said, something's not right here. And I remember even one night going to bed thinking, how is it possible? I'm only like in first grade. That's why I think it was around 5 or 6. How is it possible I can be right about such an important part of me and no one else sees that? Not even my mother and father.
Yeah, that's pretty weird.
How can the whole world be wrong and I'm right and I'm only 6 years old? Yeah. And yet I said, well, yes, right. I'm really clear. This was really, really a reality for me. But again, it was not, it was in the 1950s, not the 1990s or going into the 21st century. I had no language, transgender, transition, whatever the gender identity, dysphoria. I didn't know any of this. Was not part of my vernacular.
Would both of you sort of concur that in a way, culture is a major part of reifying for a person their own sense of their own identity? If culture doesn't mirror or echo, it's much harder for the individual to mirror or echo to themselves?
I often thought if I was on a deserted island all by myself, I would have never transitioned. How I feel who I am today is how I always felt I am, except I'm older. Right. So nothing's changed within my mindset or even in my heart set, other than there's an alignment between how I see myself and how the world around me sees me. That's where the refuah, that's where the tikkun, the healing, the completion really comes from. If I was living all by myself, I don't think I would have transitioned. I just would have lived with a body that somehow was not supposed to be, but yet it was supposed to be, because God doesn't make mistakes. But if I'm all alone, what's the difference?
Okay, so take me through puberty now in high school.
It was hell. It was hell because I was drawn to being with my girlfriends. I never identified as a gay man. I always identified as a straight teenage girl. And I have 2 younger sisters. They should live and be well. And when they would have their girlfriends over, or I'd be in school, and in the 50s I graduated high school in the late 60s. So in the early 60s, when I was in junior high school going through puberty, even though it was a regular public secular American high school, there was a mechitza. The boys were here and the girls were there. And it was a different era. It was a different tikufah. So when I could be with the girls, which was not as often as I wished, how they would talk about boys is how I thought about boys. But I was mostly with the boys, and how they would be talking about girls going through puberty. I didn't even understand them. It was, and again, I don't want to sound too dramatic or over, I don't want to exaggerate, but I really thought they were speaking a foreign language, which promoted my disconnection with them. Yeah. It's like being in Ulpan for 30 years and you can't say Boker Tov. After 30 years, what's wrong if you don't understand Boker Tov? They spoke a different language, and it disconnected me. I felt alienated. And I couldn't be that close with the girls because it wasn't allowed.
Are you expressing, similar to what I asked Micha, are you expressing any of this to anyone in high school? No.
Not until my early 40s.
Oh, my. So
yes.
Really, you're spending a lot of adulthood
Yeah.
in this kind of cage, in a sense. So
No,
you're-
not in a sense. I was in a cage.
Right.
Bet kela mamash.
Right, so you're
I was
not-
imprisoned.
You're not telling parents, you're not telling siblings, you're not telling friends. Right, so you're living a life as
Appearing as a straight male.
Right.
Became observant in my early 20s.
Ah.
Then I got involved with Chabad, became more Haredi, married a woman, started to have a family. We made Aliyah in the 80s. That's when I made Aliyah. And I was the director of the Chabad house in the Old City here in Yerushalayim. And by 1991, everything fell out from under me. I couldn't do it anymore. I could not, I'll tell you what really did it. I could not continue to go to the kotel every Friday night and say in the Amidah, V'ataheh lebeinu la'abdecha ba'emet. You know, purify my heart so I can be with you in truth. And I used to have this battle. God, if you're really there, why aren't you helping me? I'm giving you everything I can. And if you're not here, why am I doing this? So
Are you frustrated with God in this period?
Not so much God. I was very frustrated with the rabbis.
In what specifically? In what sense?
I felt unsafe around them.
How did they make you feel unsafe? How did they make you feel unsafe?
Tremendous peer pressure of what was expected of my performance as a Chabad. And it's not Chabad, it's just, I'll step back, as more of a Haredi type male figure who is a director of a very important, prestigious institute with a growing family, prominent name. We used to have 20, 25 people over every Friday night. And
I want to tell you something. For somebody who felt this way at 5, you really put yourself in the lion's den. Not only are you're actually going the other way.
That's what I said. I tried to overcompensate.
So your army is her Chabad in a sense. Like
Yes,
escape of
I did.
yourself.
I did the right thing for all the wrong reasons. I had this agreement. I call it Chad Sadadi. It's a one-sided agreement, and I will tell you, unilateral agreements don't work. This was my agreement. God, I'll go to the utmost extreme, because I come from a Jewish home, but definitely not a Haredi-ish home. I will go the beard, the hat, the gartel, the long black coat, the not having birth control, whatever you want to show you how serious I want to be a good person, a good Jew. Just please work with me. I'm just asking for one little miracle.
So what did you think you could get back in return from
Either
God?
I wake up in the morning and I feel like a man, or I wake up in the morning, not knowing I could transition at this time, I wake up in the morning and my body is that of a woman. And what I've told people before, I really didn't care what it was. What I wanted was that my mind, my heart, my feelings, and my body all be in the same place in harmony.
So give me a sign of some kind.
Right. And there were no signs. So I kept thinking, I'm not doing enough. By 1991, I realized it's not that I'm not doing enough. There's no place for me here. It was so hard. Even in my therapy, I was in therapy, and to help me move through the divorce and breaking up the family. It was very, very, during the Gulf War crisis, there was a war outside of me, inside of me. And I remember always lying to my therapist, because I really felt if I would have told him the truth, he would have said, have a cup of tea, I'll be right back. And he would have called a psychiatric ward, and they would have come and taken me. That was my truth at 40 years old. So I lied and said, because one part of my truth was I was attracted romantically to men, I said I'm a gay man. And I knew I was lying to my therapist even. So, as we say in Hebrew, chazati l'she'ilah, I left the Torah world. I left the world that I love. I felt there was, as Dorothy says in Wizard of Oz, there's no place like home. But I felt, even though I am home, there's no place for me to be at home. So I went back to New York, very broken.
And your former spouse and children remained here. Yeah. So everything is shattered, really.
Shattered.
Right? You've lost your family, you've lost your country, you've lost your religion. You're really down to ground zero.
I was going down a very dark, lonely black hole.
Right. we're going to leave you right here. I'm going to pass it back to Micha. Okay, so you have this really transformational, supportive discussion in the Army, and let's go from there. It strikes me, of course, now you're in your mid-20s at this point. So you know, I'm saying at that time you're in your early to mid-20s, that you've clearly identified, like in other words, the what's wrong of 12 has clearly cemented into I know exactly what I need to do, to the point where you even have that epiphany in the middle of the night. This is I need to do something. You've been watching videos, you have models in front of you. It's so striking to me, by the way, of course, I talked before about how culture reifies identity. You have nothing of this, and he has a lot of this because it's a completely generational change.
If I could just say, part of the reason I had nothing of this was the world I was living in. We didn't even have a TV in the house. And it was before online. No one had a computer.
Right.
Except big corporations.
Right.
There were no personal computers.
Right.
So I didn't have access to even information.
Right.
I just had my feelings.
You know, I've noticed this, stay with it for a second, I've noticed this, in fact, even when I've had a number of discussions with Steve Greenberg, that one of the things I really notice is this generational change. Like the sense of when I meet people who are LGBT over 50, over 60 for sure, the vis-a-vis like kids today, 16, 20, 25, one thing I notice is confidence, right? Where there's a sense that I can be me. I mean, obviously it's painful with all the attendant issues, but I can be me, and I can find models of me on TV, and I can find models of me everywhere, and I can find models of me on the street in every place. And when I talked to people over 60, I was alone. It's almost like a spy, right? Like I am a Russian spy. I'm embedded among the enemy.
It was Yentl. I was
right?
Yentl.
And sort of creeping your head out and who's there is such a totally different experience. The generational experience here is really very profound, right? I think when people outside of the community think of LGBT, it's just like one sort of brush. But not only are the letters different, but the age thing is huge, huge, huge.
I'm listening to Micha, and I'm telling you, I was in the Rova in the 80s.
In the Jewish quarter of the old
Jewish
city.
quarter of the old city. And if you were to tell me in the mid-80s that this would be happening right now, I would say, oh, so when is Mashiach coming? This is like post-B'viyat HaMashiach. This is post-Messianic. This would have been way beyond even a dream.
I have a secret. If you had told me in the mid-'80s, I probably would have had the same thought. Anyway, let's pass it along to you. So, you're post that conversation in the Army. What do you do next? Like, how does this work actually?
Physically?
Mentally? Everything, physically, mentally, process-wise. Just how do you start doing this?
Well, first it depends on where you live.
Okay.
Israel, I was very surprised to discover, is relatively ahead in terms of what can be done for transgender people physically. There is under the Ministry of Health a committee that transgender people can choose to go through that will, at the end of the process, make it so that any medical needs, including surgeries if people want them, will be completely subsidized.
Okay.
Which is wonderful. Also naturally has downsides, but the fact that it exists is amazing. It takes a very long time, and
The downside is that you're caught up in a bureaucracy?
That and the bureaucracy costs people money, costs people time away from work, and can take a very long time.
I see.
I was incredible.
As opposed to doing it privately, you mean?
Yes,
Okay.
privately, if you have the money, you can have it in 2 weeks. You can have surgery in 2 weeks. Hormones are not so much of an issue. It's relatively easy to get access to them.
Hormonal?
Usually, but important comment. Not everyone does everything.
Right.
Each person
Yes.
does what feels right for them.
Right.
Some people will never take hormones. Some people will never do any sort of physical change at all, and that will be perfect for them. There's a thing that such a thing as social dysphoria, where as long as people on the outside will treat you the way you need, you don't need to change anything about your body.
Meaning you could look like you're in the other body, but be identifying by the other gender, and as long as people say, although I think that would be, it's challenging people because people react to what they see naturally.
Yes,
right?
that's true. But there are people who
Okay.
live that way too, and,
All right.
and you know, so that's the first off. And everyone does what's good for them, and there's no recipe. There are no instructions. So I felt that what would be right for me would to start hormones, which means for a transgender man who was born female, it means testosterone shots that slowly will change my voice and start hair sprouting all over the place and change fat distribution throughout the body.
How old are you at this point?
I'm 28. Oh, when I
When you started?
When I started, 25.
25.
Yes.
And just to move it slightly sideways, because I am extremely interested, are you practicing at this point? Are you an observant Jewish woman?
One
a
thing-
Jewish man in a woman's body, or how do you want to put it?
One thing that never changed, that I never had any doubt about, was my belief in God. I recently said, and practice, including my belief, including practice. Recently, a friend said something to me about, you know, how gay people always say, you know, that, oh, it's not my fault. I didn't choose to be born. You know, I can't just stop being gay. So he was very struck by the fact that one time I said to him, well, I can't force myself to stop believing in God.
You saw them as analogous, in fact.
Yeah,
Wow.
absolutely.
Okay.
So
You must have had some thought, though, about why would a God put me in that position? In other words, why didn't God just make me a man? And what was your answer to yourself about that?
So I didn't have one for many years, but when I did come to the decision that night that I was going to transition, and from that moment till today, and I'm sure it will continue for the rest of my life, I am struck at moments by things that I feel are, in a way, a reason. As Yiscah mentioned before, I don't believe that God makes mistakes. I don't think that it was an accident, which I know many transgender people do. They feel like they were born in the wrong body. I don't think I was born in the wrong body. I think for some reason God chose to make me transgender. So a small example I can give is once a good friend of mine got married very young, and she came to speak. She dropped out of high school a year before high school finished. She came to speak with me when she didn't manage to go to the mikveh before her husband came back from the army after 3 weeks. And she came to me and said, I feel filthy and disgusting.
Wow.
So I told her to crawl into bed with me, and I gave her a big hug. And I told her, I spouted out all the things I'd been told in my final year of high school about how Niddah can be wonderful and romantic, and it's God's way of giving people a break from each other so you can reappreciate each other. I remember when I learned those things in high school, I was basically throwing up from hearing them. It just gave me this bad feeling inside. I knew I wasn't supposed to be hearing this stuff meant for 18-year-old girls. But after she left, I looked up and I said, well, thanks God. Now I know. I would never have had that conversation with her if I had not gone through high school as supposedly a girl.
So the way you're putting it, which is really interesting to me, is that it's actually the process of being transgender that is the point, as opposed to being stuck in the wrong framework.
That's what I personally believe for myself.
Manyan. So you opted for, so that you begin the hormonal therapy, etc. Yes. Body changes are happening.
Yes, they are. Amazing.
Was it freaky or was it wonderful? Was it both?
It was wonderful.
Because it was matching now, your body was matching
Yes.
your feelings.
It was matching my feelings, and every little hair that I found on my chin was amazing and ridiculous. I was a 13-year-old boy and a 25-year-old
woman.
Supposedly.
I just have to laugh because as a 50-year-old, when I began my transition, every process, every minute of the electrolysis or the removal of the hair was a cause for celebration.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so that's the way you kind of negotiated God. Let's talk a little bit about negotiating community, which is sometimes even trickier than negotiating God. In some ways, the narrative of your whole life and of Yiscah's life is about finding a place, right? Like finding a place within and finding a place without. So you clearly seem to find this place within. Were you able to find a place without as well? Were you able to speak about it with people, which I guess is the beginning? And
not for a long time. I did a very small amount of research into speaking with any kind of religious authority about the subject. Unfortunately, after coming across a few things online, I ceased doing that.
So you would not talk to rabbis or educators?
Not for at least a couple of years.
And parents?
I did tell my parents, obviously. I mean, I started growing facial hair, so they needed to know.
Yeah, sure.
I told my parents and my siblings and a few close friends. With each of them, I met up and told them before I began any kind of physical process. I was met with 99% support. I know that I am so incredibly lucky, and that is another reason that I am so thankful to God for this. You know, okay, so yes, I had a tough time, but I was not thrown out of any home. I was not thrown out of any job. I'm just so lucky. So from my siblings' perspective, for example, my younger sister cried when I told her because she felt like she would lose her sister. A few months later, she said, "Why did I think that? You're exactly you, just more so. You're a happy person finally, and you never have been."
So that's a very validating moment. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And for my mother, it was similar. She was sad because she didn't know what the physical effects would be, and that she didn't realize that I'd be able to walk down the street and not be called names because I looked strange.
Right.
That was mostly the reaction I got from my surroundings. But it wasn't, besides my family, those surroundings weren't a place where I was constantly living in or being in. When I decided at the end of high school to go to the army, I was already very much cut off from where I grew up, because the girls that I grew up with, their husbands will go to the army for a long time, but none of them will. And there was one girl 3 years older than me who went to the army, and one girl 5 years younger than me who went to the army from where I grew up, and that was it.
The three of you, in other words. Right. So you're already cut off in a real life sense.
Absolutely.
Beyond issues of gender and sexuality.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then when I stayed in the army for 7 years in total, that even cut me off from people I began the army with, because most people finish after 2 or 3 or 4, and I was in for 7. So by the time I finished the army, I knew that I would, wherever I went to live, didn't matter what, I would find a place where I could be me. I wasn't going to, again, live in a place where I couldn't be me. So I was going to make sure that my surroundings would have me as I was.
Okay, so we're going to move from happiness to sorrow. We're going to move to your narrative. We're going to pick it up now. So you've really reached, in some ways, the bottom. You've gone back to America. You've left behind your spouse and your kids. I'm assuming that the divorce was quick, or
very quick.
Very quick.
The rabbi said it was probably on record the fastest divorce.
Right. So you give the get and off you go.
I tried staying here. I tried living in Tel Aviv for a little while. But it didn't work out.
This is the early 90s we're talking
Yeah,
about
19,
now, right?
March
right.
of 91 is
91,
when.
right. You go back to New York City?
First I go back to New York City because that's where I'm from, and was familiar. It was familiar to me. But I felt I was just wandering, blundering, and not knowing where I was going. So I at least knew I didn't want to live through New York winters. So I moved to the West Coast, moved to California. And after 10 years from the divorce to 2001, I woke up on my 50th birthday. Oh, so shortly after I moved back to New York, though, I read my first article about transition. And I said, oh my gosh, I'm not the only person. Here I am, 41 years old, realizing I'm not the only person, and there's a way out of this prison. There is a way out. So someday, I wasn't ready right then after reading the article, but I knew there was a way out. So I knew in front of me was a transition.
And just a gap here, religiously, right, you're this Chabad man with the hat and so forth. You go back to America, what's observance at that point? You've blown it off, right?
Yeah, I went in the Jewish quarter, I moved out of Chabad into just regular, more Dati Le'umi, and then by the...
so you're living a fairly sort of secular life in California.
Not fairly, quite.
Completely. Completely secular life in California.
Completely secular, except every Friday night I cried. Every Friday night I cried because I missed Shabbat, I missed my children, I missed Yerushalayim. I felt like I was a stranger in a strange land, to quote the Chumash. But I didn't know what else to do. So what I did was I tried to use my own life as an experiment, and I started to date men. I know this may sound hard to figure out or to understand, but I tried to date men, and I succeeded. Gay men who were more masculine presenting, who wanted to be with a man who was more female presenting. And it worked. And then I fell in love with a wonderful man, and after a couple of years, we broke up, and it was very painful for him to break up with me. We shared a lot in common. And he said, I realize what's going on here. You want to be my wife. And
he's gay.
And he's gay.
Right.
He said, I'm a gay man. I've appreciated some of your personality that's a compliment or contrast to mine, but I don't want to be with a woman. But as someone who loves you, if you ever want to really transition, I will support you 100%, because I really believe that's what you need to do. And shortly thereafter, after breaking up with him, my whole world was crushed. I woke up on my 50th birthday. That was the bottom. When you mentioned earlier, it was after the breakup, I felt so disconnected from life. I could cry now because my life is so blessed. 17 years later, I woke up on that day and I said, this is what I said to myself. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep breathing breath. Micha talked before about God giving each one of another day to live. I had no more strength to try to be someone else. Religious, not religious, straight, gay, all of it was one big lie for me. And I could no longer breathe breath into someone else's body.
Yeah, go ahead.
I could no longer do that while I was becoming lifeless. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a matter of being suicidal. I really thought I was dying.
So that's what I was going to ask about. Both of you have described this in very visceral, physical ways. And I noted when I did read a very moving book by Joy Layden, who's a professor of English literature at YU, about the physical aspect of it, as if there's this almost feeling of feeling sick and feeling like you're dying, although there's no actual symptomology in that way. And that was very striking to me. I've always been trying to figure out what that is, like pushing somehow against
I felt at 50, I was 120.
So was it reflected in the way you walked, the way you talked, the way you...
Everything. Actually, I saw just recently in Israel, I was giving a lecture and someone in the crowd recognized me. He was my chiropractor from years ago. And he said, your posture has I said, well, I don't feel I have the weight of the world on me anymore.
Yeah.
But there was something else that happened that day. I so missed Israel. I so missed Judaism and spiritual living with the Torah. I so wanted to be right with God. I wasn't worried about God being not right with me. I was not right with God because I was lying. God was not the problem. I was the problem. So I begged God this time, no chad sadadi, no unilateral agreements. I'll do this if you do that. I just said, please, help me live a life of truth. I really say it now. Purify my heart so I can be with you in truth.
So this is 2001 in California.
Yes.
After the breakup.
Right.
You're really, this is the
I hit my
moment,
spiritual
really.
rock bottom. That was my spiritual rock bottom. And I felt like a seed that's planted in the ground. It's dark, it's cold, it's lonely, and it begins to decay. And just at the moment where if it decays any further, it will die, that's when it sprouts.
And how did it sprout for you?
I felt for the first time in my life encouraged. I don't have to do this.
Encouraged by your ex-partner, you mean? Or
Well,
by...
I think that was, we say in the Gemara, L'makom, God has lots of different emissaries. I think that was a message, but I felt deep inside, if I could be honest with God and honest with me, I could really do this.
So that's an interior strength you had yourself, really.
It was there in
way.
potential.
Right.
It was waiting to blossom. And it happened. My transition was the easiest thing I've done in my life.
So what happened the next morning?
The next morning.
Or the morning after that?
The morning after that, I just sat with my decision. I really sat with it.
How long?
I want to say about, I don't know, maybe 6 months.
Okay.
My MO was always running, and burning bridges. I realized if I'm really going to do this, I need to read, I need to educate, I need to go online now that I could go online, and really go about this really deliberately from a place of strength, not from a place of fear, where I'm not running away, but I'm running to.
So now, it's funny you say that. Now you've kind of entered the new world, right? Because things are available, dissemination of information, the internet, and so on. It's not like you're back in Long Island in 1967.
This is 2001 in California, and I made my first. I remember going to a trans related fair in Denver. I had moved to Colorado for various reasons, and I went to I met another guy and fell in love, and I'm not going to waste our time on that. Not that it's a waste of my life, but we were short for time. But I did move to Colorado. I went to this fair, and I learned a lot from the different workshops. And that's when I made my first appointment to see an endocrinologist to begin hormone replacement therapy. And, one thing followed the next and followed the next till it was complete.
And when was that?
It was completed in 2005.
So about 4 years, 3.5 years. Right.
And again, this was the new me. I'm not rushing out of fear. I'm walking day by day and meditating and contemplating and getting closer back to God, feeling more and more in alignment with Hashem. And that carried, as I said in my TED Talk, this was as much, if not more, of a spiritual transition as it was of a gender transition. That was just like the form, but the content was really being right with myself and with God and the world around me.
I'm going to get back to you. I am intrigued by, all of us here are aware of the kinds of gender binaries that exist in Judaism, and in some ways, obviously, many years of feminist critique about the opportunities that are afforded to a Jewish man as opposed to a Jewish woman. I wonder what that feels like for you. In other words, have you become aware of the fact of almost in a way, unfairly, now having jumped to the other side, that things have stuff opened up for you? Have you become aware of kind of, what does this be like to be a Jewish guy?
Well, absolutely. I have no choice about the
Right.
fact. I walk down the street and people ask me to join a minyan.
Right.
And then I have to think about it. Can I? Do I need to tell them that maybe I shouldn't? Maybe it bothers them.
How do you think about it?
Again, I know this is an uncommon opinion on the subject, but I decided, at least for the moment, that if it's a random person asking me on the street, then I'll say I have a medical condition that means I can't be part of a minyan. But I'd gladly be an 11th.
Uh-huh. Okay.
If
So in other words, you're okay with being on the men's side. You just don't want to necessarily weigh in as a man. That's a conviction you hold about yourself? Or
No.
it's what you think.
I don't want to know if there's someone there who doesn't think of me as being part of the minyan. So I'd rather avoid the conversation. It hurts me to hear that, because even if they don't intend to say, I don't see you as a man, that's how it feels.
Have you spoken to anybody about this, like halachically, how it works? Or?
Only very vaguely. Usually I haven't gotten an answer, I think for two reasons. One is because I'm not looking for one. I've only asked it like as to present the question.
Yeah.
And the other is because people don't know enough. And when I say people, I mean religious authorities.
This is a new field, really.
Yeah, I'm not saying it as a critique of anyone, but if you don't know enough about the experience and the physical realities and mental realities of someone who is transgender, and then you have also not looked into halachot that could possibly in some way relate to the subject, of course you don't know what to say.
What's your prayer life like now? In other words, are you putting on tefillin? Like you're doing real things?
Yes, I felt very excited to learn how to do all these new things, but also very scared, because I hate lying. And when I lived in Tzfat and began my transition, and looked like a 12-year-old boy, and came to a Chabad Bet Knesset in the neighborhood and asked the rabbi to teach me how to put on tefillin. And then he asked a bit about my life story. Yes, I've always been religious, so wait, how do you not know to put on tefillin? It's a bit complicated. If I thought about it, I should have said something like, I come from a different kind of Judaism, which is true. He would have assumed reform or something. It's scary because people expect me to know things. Because if I had grown up as a young religious man, I would know all sorts of things and know how to do things. I was called up for an aliyah to the Torah on Shabbat. I didn't know the choreography. You're supposed to hold... I didn't know the words.
Yeah.
And how do you explain that to someone? In the middle, it's happening right now.
Right.
I have found...
you guys have such integrity. I had a million lies in my head. As he's talking, I'm thinking, just say this, you know.
So there was one time after getting that aliyah where I said to the rabbi afterwards, because I felt uncomfortable. It was the first time I'd been called up to take some kind of role in a Bet Knesset in my life. So I didn't know. I didn't know anything. I didn't know my opinion on the subject. So afterwards, I went to the rabbi and I said, I have a medical condition. I don't count for a minyan. And he's like, oh, wow, is it that thing with your bowels? I didn't answer. And he continued assuming it was that. I looked it up. There is a condition that indeed means that a person cannot be concluded in a minyan. Because they can't control when they have to go.
Right. So you had that in place.
I didn't lie.
Yeah.
But I let them assume that. I have found that since coming out and becoming who I've always really been meant to be, I've moved to other parts of Judaism that I will say I did not know existed even. Mostly if it's halachic egalitarian, minyanim, and I remember the first time I was in a minyan like that, I felt incredibly uncomfortable, I was thinking, there's a woman sitting next to me. And then I remembered that for most of my life, I'd only sat next to women in the Beth Knesset. But it felt so strange because there are separate sections.
It's not used to it, yeah.
But today, I feel like in places like that, I don't have to think about whether
Yes.
3 people walk out of the room. Do I have to say, excuse me, everyone, pause. I was born female. Do we want to continue? And those things cross. I would obsessively count people in the minyan when I was there to make sure there were at least 11.
Right. So it dissolves those walls for you.
And also, regarding your question at the beginning that prompted this, I feel uncomfortable being the privileged man on the side. I had never been close to a Sefer Torah before. I did not know there was no Nikud. And I think about all the people who sat in the Ezrat Nashim with me for 25 years, and I'm sure that many of them don't know that too.
They didn't know there's dots underneath. That there's no dots on the scroll.
They don't know what it looks like inside.
Yeah.
They don't know that you hold on.
Right.
You know, and that's just a tiny thing. There's so many more. It's just one symptom. So
has becoming a man made you more empathic to the situation of Jewish women in a way?
I think I always was, but it's become different because when I voice it, I'm not just another crazy feminist woman. I'm a religious man who's expressing empathy towards religious women.
How ironic is all this? So, speaking of like sort of ongoing religious journeys, so for you, we're picking it up here. You've transitioned. It's 2005. You're in your mid-50s or going on your mid-50s. What's happening now with you and Judaism?
I'm returning. And I remember the first, the first Friday night I lit Shabbat lights. It was amazing. I have a whole chapter in my book about that. I felt so connected for the first time through a mitzvah to my lineage, to my mother, to my grandmother, to my great-grandmother. Although they were not Shemot Shabbat, Shemot Kashrut, they always lit on Friday night. And I felt so connected to Jewish women, not only in my own family lineage and my own daughters and daughters-in-law, but to the Jewish people as a woman. I never felt that when I was observing mitzvot, projecting myself or presenting myself as a man. I didn't feel that sense of I'm part of Am Yisrael and I'm part of continuing this legacy that we've received. It was incredible. And la'at, I had to actually gauge myself. I said, Yiscah, don't rush back. You rushed in once, you go day by day.
How do you think about the feminist critique? In other words, you're a Jewish woman. Does it resonate for you, or it's just not even part of your language?
Most of it's not part of my language. I don't miss anything on the men's side of the mechitza because, to quote Micha, it was for me a lie. I felt I was a spy. I didn't belong there. I also was not surrounded 3 times a day, 7 days a week, ongoingly by men who felt privileged. As I say to many women, a lot of what you think you're missing is a fantasy. It's not the reality. But I can tell you what goes on that side of the mechitza. It's not what you think it is. What you think it is, I think the men would like for it to be that way. But it isn't.
Although I think they would like the opportunity
to
discover that for themselves.
So in the egal world, they can.
Right.
In the egal world. And I've davened, I daven sometimes here at Baka, at Sion with Rabbat Tamar, because of her. It's not, I really, at this point in my journey, whether there's a mechitza or not, it's of no interest to me. I prefer to daven in a spiritually, musically emphasized minyan where there is a mechitza, because the energy with the women is my energy. However, to be around a figure like her and her teachings, I'll go there, and it's very fulfilling. So I don't feel second class. I don't feel less privileged. Actually, I feel very blessed, and I feel privileged to be able to go to sleep every night without knots in my stomach. Now, whatever problems maybe women incur that are feminist supported, I may agree with. And it's wonderful that now they're my problems rather than someone else's problems. And just like the men also have problems or challenges.
So you found a community, you found a people, really, now to be connected to.
More than just the whole people is Am Yisrael. I'm not locked into a box. I'm post-denominational. I feel a little bit of me is in all the movements, and the bigger part of me is in none of the movements, especially having returned home, 7 years ago. I just walk every day. I wake up and say Moda Ani and say, is this for real? Because I never expected it to be like this, to resume teaching and lecturing and having a private spiritual mentoring practice and being invited to Limud conferences in places all over the world to inform the narrative with spiritual Torah of what it means to really live a life of truth. That being said, I do recognize at times from the men's side, quote of the Mechitza, misogyny, and I feel it hurts me. I also feel transphobia at times, and it hurts me. And that's part of the process of developing and cultivating more compassion and more education and more being on that path to include rather than exclude. I believe it begins with me.
So Micha, finally, I'd like both of you to talk about what you would like people to know about your experience, the kinds of questions that you think are good questions, the kinds of questions you think are not good questions, the kinds of issues that you think, maybe let's even say unwittingly, people are not aware of, that maybe are things they should be aware of, and so on. I'm talking here specifically in Jewish and or religious communities.
That's a very loaded question. I think the most basic thing is that God loves us too. And God loves every human that God created. So it's not important to ask me the first time you meet me if I learned how to put on tefillin or not, and how old I was when I did. It's more important to ask, did you find a place to be where you feel good religiously, a community that accepts you? I think I'll have to think more about your question.
Okay. Yiscah?
Could you ask the question again?
What would you like people in Jewish religious communities to know about not just your experience, but about encountering transgender people, the kinds of things that are good to say, the kinds of things that might not be so good to say, and the kinds of even perhaps halachic issues that they may not even be aware of that you'd like to put on their radar?
Okay, I'm going to answer that through two different pairs of lenses. One is me as a 67-year-old, although I have a very young energy. I'm 67 years old, I'm secure, I'm evolved, I'm still evolving, I'm still maturing, but I can handle myself in most situations, and I have, thank God. I'm very concerned, though, for people that I know in their 20s and 30s who really want to be part of, one way or another, the religious world, and who have been made to not only feel marginalized, but less than human. And I'm very concerned about their well-being, especially as a leader and someone who people look up to. So what I would say to the religious world is follows, and I have said it to the religious world. First of all, as my father, may he live and be well, brought me up, if you have nothing nice to say, don't say anything. I expect religious people, especially rabbis, rabbanim, rabbaniot, leaders, educators, to role model in the most difficult situations, in the most challenging, uncomfortable situations. I expect them to role model Ahavat Yisrael. I expect them to role model, give everyone the benefit of the doubt. I expect them to role model that we want you to be part of us, although we don't know how that will look like, because this is new for us. I expect the religious world to say, you're created as equally in the image of God as I am, and to be honest, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with some of your life decisions. That's a place of truth. I was uncomfortable with me for 50 years. I can't expect the whole world to join my venture, but be honest with compassion. Be honest with a sense of, you're here. What can we do? Ask the question, what can I do to make you feel more comfortable? Maybe I can do it, maybe I can't do it, but at least let's be in dialogue. Instead of, you make me feel uncomfortable, I don't have a precedent for this, I don't have the knowledge, I'm pushing you out. You are a perverted, disgusting creature of God. And as someone here in Israel who was raised in Mea Shearim came to me for counsel, I'm not a therapist, but for spiritual direction. She's all of 22 years old, born in a male body, brought up in Mea Shearim. She went to her rabbis and asked for guidance. And they said, this is what one of them said to her, and I want to be sure not to exaggerate. If we read that you would have committed suicide, we wouldn't have been as upset if it was somebody else. And that pushed her right out of Judaism. So it's to go about a difficult situation with gentleness. With gentleness and with kindness. I always believe this is what part of our mandate is. At the end of the day, what does it mean to live a life of Torah? It's not so I can always be in the comfort zone. It's so I can be in the discomfort zone and be educated and informed in how to move it and move through it. Because we're dealing with people's souls. Everyone in this room, everyone who will be watching this, is created equally in the image of God. And God, as Micha said, I believe created every one of us with the same amount of love. We were created in love. And when I ask of the religious communities, if you say you believe in God, if you say you believe in Torah, then fulfill the mitzvah in Devarim, v'halachta b'dorachav. Walk in His ways instead of your way. And His way is a way of compassion.
Thank you very much, both of you. It's been a pleasure being with you.
Thank you.